Hello. I'm really glad you're here tonight. This hour is different from the rest of the day. It doesn't ask you to decide anything. It doesn't ask you to perform or explain or keep up. It simply invites you to lie still and let your thoughts move at their own pace. As the years pass, nighttime becomes a kind of companion, a place where the mind is free to wander without interruption, where memories return, not urgently but patiently, where understanding settles in quietly without needing words. Later in life, the mind doesn't race the way it once did. It reflects, it revisits, it connects dots that once seemed unrelated. And it does this most honestly when the lights are off and the world has gone silent. This space is for those thoughts, the ones that don't surface during the day, the ones that arrive only when you're alone with yourself, resting, remembering, and gently making sense of a long lived-in life. So take a slow breath, let your body soften into the bed, and allow this night to meet you where you are. And now, before we begin, if this kind of honest, gentle reflection speaks to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And down in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united in these late hours when the world finally grows still. So settle in, adjust your pillows, find a comfortable position, and know that for the next hour, you're not alone in whatever wisdom you're carrying, whatever understanding you've earned, whatever truths rise to the surface when the lights go out. Let's begin. Close your eyes now, or let them remain soft and unfocused. There is nothing you need to see tonight, nothing you need to watch for. The world outside has settled, the sounds have dimmed, and in this darkness, in this quiet, something ancient and extraordinary is about to find you. You are going on a journey tonight, not forward, not even inward, exactly. You are going backward, across centuries, across continents, across the red dust of Central Africa, where rivers thread through the land like the veins in an old hand, where the forest breathes slowly, where the earth holds memory in its soil the way you hold memory in your body, deep and unannounced, present even when you're not thinking about it. You are going to a place and a time that most people have never truly imagined. And yet, when you arrive there, something in you will recognize it. Something deep and old in your bones will say, yes, this is real. This happened. This mattered. You are going to the Lunda Empire. Let that name settle over you like a blanket. The Lunda Empire. Say it quietly in your mind. Lunda. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It simply arrives. The way all important things arrive when you stop chasing them and start allowing them. The Lunda Empire. A civilization of extraordinary sophistication that rose in the heart of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, spreading its influence outward like rings on still water, outward into Zambia, outward into Angola, outward into Malawi, outward across a vast, interconnected web of trade, culture, kinship, and commerce that stretched for thousands of miles across the African interior. You never learned about this in school. almost no one did. This is one of the great silences of the history you were taught. The story of Africa's interior empires, its merchant networks, its sophisticated systems of governance and exchange. These stories were buried or overlooked or deliberately omitted. And so you grew up knowing the names of European empires and Asian dynasties and Middle Eastern caliphates. But the Lunda Empire, one of the most expansive and durable trading civilizations in the history of the African continent, remained a stranger to you until tonight. Tonight, under these covers, in the darkness that asks nothing of you, you are going to receive something true, something real, something that has always been part of the world's story, waiting patiently for you to have the stillness to receive it. Breathe slowly. Let your body sink a little deeper into the mattress. Your shoulders can release now. Your jaw can soften. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is only this voice, this story, this ancient breathing empire rising out of the darkness to meet you. The Lunda Empire was not built in a day. No great thing is. It grew slowly, the way forests grow, the way rivers find their course, the way understanding comes to a person who has lived long enough to stop expecting answers and started allowing them instead. It began somewhere in the 17th century, in the lands between the Casai River and the upper Zambezi River, in the space that now lies within the southern reaches of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There, a people known as the Rund lived. They were skilled farmers, hunters, fishermen, people who understood the land the way you understand your own home, the way you know without thinking which drawer sticks, which room catches the afternoon light, which corner of the garden goes quiet first when evening comes. You know that feeling, that sense of belonging so deep it doesn't need explaining. The Run people had that with their land, and from that rootedness, from that deep and settled knowledge of who they were and where they belonged, something remarkable began to grow. A leader emerged. His name was Chibinda Ilunga, and the story of how he came to the Lunda people is not just history. It is mythology. It is the kind of story that a civilization keeps telling itself across generations, because it contains something essential and true about who that civilization is and who it aspires to be. Chibinda Ilunga was a hunter, a great hunter from the Luba kingdom to the north. He wandered into Lunda territory as hunters do, following the animals, following the invisible paths that skilled trackers learn to read in bent grass and disturbed soil and the particular silence of a place where prey has just passed through. And there, in the forest, in the territory of the Lunda, he met a woman named Ruage. She was a queen, a leader of her people, a woman of power in a world that understood female power differently than the world you grew up in. She held authority. She held lineage. She held the sacred trust of her ancestors and her people. She was not someone who waited. She was someone who decided. And Chibinda Ilunga and Ruage chose each other. This is how empires sometimes begin. Not in conquest, not in violence, but in alliance, in the decision of two powerful people to merge their worlds, to say what you are and what I am together can become something greater than either of us could be alone. You understand this. You've lived long enough to know that the most powerful unions in life are rarely about dominance. They're about complementarity, about two things coming together and creating a third thing that neither could have made alone. About recognizing in another person, not a mirror, but a completion. So Chibinda Ilunga brought with him the spiritual authority and political sophistication of the Luba kingdom, and Ruage brought with her the deep territorial knowledge and ancestral legitimacy of the Lunda people. And from their union, a dynasty was born, the Muant Yav dynasty, the rulers of the Lunda Empire, kings who would reign for generations upon generations, kings whose authority would extend across a territory vast enough to swallow entire European nations and still have room to spare. But tonight, we're not really here to talk about kings and queens alone. We are here to talk about something quieter, something more intricate, something that, in many ways, is more impressive than any throne or crown or military campaign ever mounted. We are here to talk about trade. Let the word arrive softly. Trade. The movement of goods between people. The fundamental human recognition that you have something I need, and I have something you need, and both of us are better for the exchange. This recognition, so simple in its core, becomes extraordinarily complex when you expand it across hundreds of miles, across dozens of language groups, across rivers and forests and savannas and mountain ranges, across seasons and generations and political upheavals, across every obstacle that the land and the human heart can place in the way. The Lunda Empire built a trade network that did exactly this, and it did so with a level of sophistication that still astonishes historians and economists who study it today. Let your breathing slow even further now. There is no urgency here. The story will keep coming. The night is long and patient, and so is this. Breathe in, breathe out. Feel the covers settling around you like something warm and well-known. Imagine you are standing at the center of the Lunda heartland. You are somewhere near the Nkalani River, in the fertile lands of the upper Congo basin. Around you is the Musumba, the royal capital. It is not a city in the European sense, all stone and permanence and rigid geometry. It is something more alive than that. A great sprawling settlement of thatched compounds and open courts and constant movement. People arriving, people departing, people bringing things and carrying things away. The Musumba is breathing. It pulses like a living heart. And you notice, even standing here at the very center, that everything is connected, like a spider's web caught in early morning light, like the roots of a great tree that you cannot see, but can feel spreading and spreading beneath your feet, reaching outward toward a water and nourishment. Roads, not paved roads, but paths worn into the red earth by 1,000,000 footsteps, radiate outward from this center like the spokes of a great wheel, each path leading somewhere, each path carrying something, each path part of a vast living network that stretches to every horizon and beyond. This is what you are seeing. This is what you are beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time in your life. The Lunda Empire, was not just a political entity, it was a commercial one, a logistical one, an organizational miracle of the pre-modern world. It was a civilization that understood with extraordinary and almost modern clarity that power does not come only from armies. It comes from connections, from relationships, from the ability to move things, people, information, and goods across vast distances with efficiency and reliability and mutual benefit. The Lunda Empire understood something that took the modern world centuries to rediscover: that networks are power, that the one who controls the flows controls everything. Let that settle in the warm darkness. The one who controls the flows controls everything. You've seen this in your own long life. You've known people who seem to know everyone, who seem to be at the center of every important conversation, who move through the world with a quiet ease that others couldn't replicate. Those people were not necessarily the loudest or the most forceful or the most aggressive. They were the most connected, the most central to the webs that held things together, and their power came not from what they possessed, but from what they facilitated. The Lunda Empire was that kind of power. Connected power, web power, the power of a center that holds because everything flows through it. Now, what exactly flowed through this network? What were the goods that moved along those thousands of miles of trade paths? What did the Lunda have that others wanted? And what did others have that the Lunda needed in return? The answers to these questions are a map of the ancient world's deepest desires, and they are more sophisticated, more varied, more surprising than you might expect. Let us begin with copper. Copper, the metal that changed the world. Long before iron became dominant, long before steel made everything possible, there was copper, and the lands of Central Africa sat on some of the richest copper deposits on the entire planet. The Copper Belt, as it would eventually come to be known, straddling what is now Zambia and the southern reaches of the Democratic Republic of Congo, produced copper of extraordinary purity, and the Lunda Empire sat directly above this resource, directly in control of it, directly positioned to benefit from the world's need for it. But copper in the Lunda world was not simply industrial material, it was symbolic. In the belief systems of Central African civilizations, copper carried sacred resonance that goes beyond anything a modern industrial mindset can easily grasp. It represented life force, it represented prestige, it represented authority and connection to the divine. A chief who wore copper ornaments was a chief who commanded respect not just from the people around him, but from the unseen world. Copper crosses, called handa, served simultaneously as currency and as objects of profound spiritual significance. They were passed between hands, not just as payment, but as something close to prayer. You have objects in your own life that carry meaning far beyond their material value. A piece of jewelry that belonged to someone you loved and lost, a photograph worn soft at the edges from years of handling, a letter folded and refolded so many times the creases have become part of the paper itself. These things carry weight beyond their physical weight. They hold something intangible and irreplaceable, something that cannot be appraised or insured, or replaced. Copper was like that in the Lunda world, both currency and sacred object, both practical and profound. And the Lunda Empire traded it far and wide, in quantities and across distances that were extraordinary for their time. Copper moved eastward toward the Great Lakes region. It moved southward into the lands of the Lozi and the Tonga. It moved westward toward the Atlantic coast, where Portuguese merchants were beginning to establish trading posts at places like Luanda on the Angolan coast, and it moved northward, deeper into the Congo basin, into networks that connected eventually, though sometimes across many patient intermediaries, to the trade routes of East Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world. Along with copper moved salt. Perhaps no commodity in all of human history has been more essential and more universally sought than salt. Salt preserved food in a world without refrigeration. Salt made meat last through the long seasons of scarcity. Salt was health in a literal, physiological sense. Communities without reliable access to salt were communities in genuine danger, physically weakened, unable to sustain themselves through difficult seasons. The Lunda Empire controlled several important salt sources, and salt moved through their networks constantly, quietly, invisibly vital. The way oxygen moves through a body, unremarkable until it stops. Then there was ivory. The great elephant herds of Central Africa were a living resource of extraordinary value in the ancient and early modern world. Elephant tusks, either carved into objects of breathtaking beauty or traded as raw material, moved through Lunda networks in quantities that are difficult for us to fully imagine today. Ivory moved eastward toward the Swahili coast, where Arab and Swahili merchants had been conducting commerce since the early centuries of the Common Era. From the Swahili coast, ivory traveled to India, to the Persian Gulf, to China, to every corner of the world that had learned to desire it. The tusk of an elephant that lived and died in the forests near the Lunda heartland might eventually become part of a chess set in a wealthy merchant's home in Guangzhou, or an ornamented throne in an Indian palace, or a sacred object in an Arab collector's cabinet. This is the length and reach of the connections that the Lunda were woven into, even if they never saw the final destination of what they traded, even if they never knew the names of the people who eventually held what they sent out into the world. Let your mind move slowly along these trade routes now, like water finding its downhill course, like smoke rising in perfectly still air, drifting without hurry toward wherever it is going. There is no urgency to this movement. The routes have been established over generations. The paths are worn and certain and reliable. You can follow them without haste. Beeswax was another commodity of quiet but consistent importance. Gathered from the vast forest hives of Central Africa's remarkable bee populations, beeswax served multiple purposes in the ancient and early modern world. It was used in candle making, in medicine, in leather preservation, and in the lost wax casting technique that produced the extraordinary bronze sculptures for which West and Central Africa became famous. Beeswax moved through Lunda trade networks toward the Atlantic coast, where Portuguese merchants loaded it onto ships bound for European markets. where the demand for it never diminished. And then there was dried fish. The rivers of Central Africa teem with life in quantities that are difficult to comprehend. The Congo River system alone is one of the most biodiverse aquatic environments on the planet, second only to the Amazon in the richness of its fish species. Communities along the great rivers developed sophisticated methods of catching, drying, and preserving fish that could then be traded inland to communities far from any water. Dried fish was protein. Dried fish was survival through the dry season. Dried fish moved through the Lunda networks in regular, reliable flows, connecting riverine communities to inland ones in relationships of mutual dependence that sustained entire populations across seasons of difficulty. The rivers were the highways of this world. This is something you understand better at night than you do in daylight. In daylight, rivers are obstacles to be crossed, boundaries between places, lines of separation on a map. But in darkness, when you close your eyes and simply imagine, rivers become something else entirely. They become paths. They become invitation. They become the arteries of a living civilization. The great rivers of Central Africa, the Congo, the Kasai, the Kwango, the Luapula, the Upper Zambezi, these were not barriers to the Lunda trade network. They were the network. They were the infrastructure that made the network possible. Along their banks, communities of fishermen and skilled paddlers had lived for generations, developing the dugout canoes and the deep river knowledge that allowed goods to move swiftly downstream and laboriously but steadily upstream. You can imagine a dugout canoe on the Casai River at dawn, the mist rising off the water in slow, soft columns, the sound of a paddle cutting through the current, a trader sitting among bundles of dried fish and copper ingots wrapped in bark cloth, moving downstream toward the next community, carrying the promise of exchange and the continuity of connection. Carrying not just goods, but the ongoing commitment of one community to another, the living proof that the network holds, that it can be trusted, that it is real. The rivers also served another purpose in the Lunda trade system. They were the arteries along which information traveled. A trader paddling downstream would carry news of prices in the communities upriver, news of political changes, news of new goods available or old goods suddenly scarce, news of drought and abundance and the movements of powerful people and the decisions of important chiefs. This information was itself a commodity, often more valuable in the immediate moment than any tangible thing in the canoe below it. The Lunda understood this, perhaps more clearly than any political entity of their era in Central Africa. The Lunda understood that information is the invisible goods that makes all other goods more valuable. You know this truth as well. You have lived through enough of history to have watched the information revolution of your own lifetime. You have watched the world reshape itself dramatically and rapidly around the movement of information. And you know that this revolution did not begin with computers or telecommunications or fiber optic cables under the ocean. It began whenever and wherever human beings first recognized that knowing something others did not know was a form of power, unlike any other. The Lunda knew it. They cultivated it. Their long-distance traders were information brokers as much as they were commodity traders. And this made them more than merchants. It made them intelligence networks, diplomatic assets, essential to the empire's ability to adapt and respond and evolve in a world that was always changing beneath its feet. Now, the most remarkable thing about the Lunda trade network was not any individual commodity that moved through it. It was the system itself, the architecture of exchange that made it all function, the invisible structure underneath all the visible activity. Because here is something you understand from your own long life of watching the world. Things do not happen by accident. Not the things that last, not the things that truly matter. The things that endure are built deliberately, carefully, with sustained attention to relationships and structure and the slow, patient accumulation of trust. You cannot rush trust. You cannot buy it or impose it or manufacture it in a hurry. It grows the way trees grow, invisibly most of the time, evidenced only when a storm comes, and the tree either holds or falls. The Lunda Empire built something that historians call the ruined system of political incorporation. This is a phrase that lives in academic papers and scholarly journals. But underneath the careful academic language is something very human, something you've seen in your own experience of the world. The Lunda didn't simply conquer. They didn't simply impose their rule by force and expect grateful submission. They did something considerably more sophisticated. When the Lunda expanded their territory, when their influence spread outward from the heartland into new regions, they brought people into their system through a process of adoption, of kinship, of what you might recognize in your own life and experience simply as belonging. A local leader in a newly incorporated region would receive Lunda political titles and symbols of office. They would become, in a meaningful and operational sense, part of the Lunda family, not through blood necessarily, but through a system of fictive kinship, through shared titles and shared obligations and shared identity. And in exchange for these things, for the prestige and protection and connection that came with Lunda affiliation, these local leaders would participate in the trade network. They would facilitate the movement of goods through their territory. They would ensure safe passage for Lunda traders. They would contribute to the flow and benefit from it in return. This is genius, not military genius, not the genius of the battlefield or the siege or the cavalry charge, but organizational genius, the genius of building a system that people actively want to participate in. That offers them something real and valuable in exchange for their cooperation. That creates stakeholders rather than subjects, that builds from consent rather than coercion. You've seen the alternative. You've seen systems built purely on force and the threat of violence. And you know from watching the world across a long lifetime that systems built purely on force are brittle things. They last only until the force falters, until the army weakens, until the strong man dies or loses his nerve. But systems built on mutual benefit, on shared identity, on relationships where everyone has a genuine stake in the outcome, those systems are resilient. They bend without breaking. They absorb disruption and continue. They outlast the individuals who built them because the individuals who benefit from them have every reason to maintain them. The Lunda Empire lasted for nearly 3 centuries as a significant continental power. 3 centuries, longer than the United States has existed as a nation, longer than most European empires managed to sustain their dominance. And this durability was not an accident. It was the direct result of a system that understood how to create longevity through inclusion, through the making of stakeholders, through the offering of belonging to those who might otherwise have become enemies. Eastward, this principle found its most dramatic expression in the 18th century, when a powerful Lunda leader named Kazembe established a great subsidiary kingdom on the Luapula River, near modern Lake Mweru, in the region that now straddles Zambia and the eastern Congo. This kingdom, known to history as the Kingdom of Kazembe, became one of the most important commercial nodes in the east-west trade system of the entire continent. Kazembe sat at the intersection of trade routes flowing in from the interior, from the Lunda heartland to the west, and routes connecting eastward to the Swahili coast. Goods from the Atlantic world could reach Kazembe's court. Goods from the Indian Ocean world could flow in the opposite direction. Kazembe was, in the language of modern logistics, a distribution hub of continental importance, a central node where flows from multiple directions met and were redistributed across the network. European explorers who eventually reached Kazembe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were consistently astonished by what they found. They had expected wilderness. They had expected simplicity. They had expected to feel, as explorers often expected to feel, that they were encountering people who needed what Europeans had to offer. Instead, they found courts of considerable sophistication, rulers of evident and practiced political intelligence, markets bustling with goods from across the entire continent, a civilization that had no need of their presence to be functional, complex, or deeply impressive. Let your breathing deepen now. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let the story continue to move through you like something warm and unhurried, like the first light of morning moving slowly across a quiet room, like the feeling of being known by someone who has known you for a very long time, who does not need you to explain yourself, who already understands. We are only halfway through this night's journey. There is more to explore, more to understand, more to let wash over you in the slow, gentle way that only nighttime allows. The Empire has many more stories to share with you, about the women who shaped it at every level, about the long-distance traders who were its nervous system, about the connections it built with the wider world, connections that reached from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, and everything in between, about its eventual transformation under colonial pressure and what it left behind in the soil and the memory of a people who never forgot. But for now, simply rest in what you've already received tonight. The image of the Musumba, breathing and alive at the center of the web, the red earth paths radiating outward through the land like spokes from a wheel that never stops turning. The traders moving slowly and purposefully along routes worn smooth by the footsteps of generations before them. The copper and the salt and the ivory and the dried fish and the beeswax flowing through the network like blood through a body, keeping it alive, keeping it whole, keeping it connected across distances that once seemed impossible to bridge. You are here. The night is here. The story is here, and you are exactly where you need to be. You are still here. Good. The night has held you gently, and it will continue to hold you. There is no need to reach for anything, no need to gather yourself or prepare or brace. Simply allow what remains of this story to come to you the way warmth comes to a room that has been cold, slowly, pervasively, until you can no longer remember what the cold felt like. We left the Lunda Empire at the river's edge, at the edge of the great commercial web that stretched from the heartland outward in every direction. We understood the goods that moved through it. We understood the system of inclusion that gave it its remarkable durability. But there is more. There is always more when you go deep enough into any great and honest story. There are layers beneath layers, people behind the structures, lives behind the commerce. And tonight, in this quiet and unhurried darkness, you're going to meet some of those people. You're going to understand what it felt like to live inside this network, not as a king or a queen, not as a historian looking backward across centuries with the comfortable distance of analysis, but as a human being moving through a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty, trying to do what all human beings have always tried to do: survive, connect, matter. So settle deeper into the mattress now. Feel the familiar weight of the covers. Feel your body releasing the last of whatever the day left in your muscles. And come with me, back to the red earth paths, back to the mist on the Casai River, back to a world that was alive and intricate and fully itself long before any outsider arrived to name it or claim it or attempt to rewrite it. Let us talk about the traders themselves, the long-distance merchants who were the living threads of the Lunda network. Who were these people? What did their lives actually look like? What did they carry in their bodies, not just in their packs, as they moved through the world? They were called, in some regions and some eras of the empire, the Ovimbundu, or the Imbangala, or simply traders of the Lunda network. But whatever name the historical record has assigned them, they were something older and more universal than any category can fully contain. They were wanderers who had made wandering into a discipline, into an art, into a calling that required skills so numerous and so varied that the training for it lasted years, sometimes an entire youth. You have known people like this in your own life, people who move through the world differently than everyone else, who seem to speak every language, understand every context, navigate every social terrain with an ease that others could not manufacture or replicate. These people were not born knowing how to do these things. They were made by years of exposure and adaptation, by thousands of small negotiations and adjustments and recalibrations, by the slow accumulation of what you might simply call worldliness, the deep, lived, embodied knowledge that comes only from having been in enough different rooms, with enough different people who want enough different things. The long-distance traders of the Lunda network were like that. They were worldly in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word. They spoke multiple languages, not just passably, functionally, and with enough fluency to negotiate, to persuade, to establish trust, to detect deception. Because deception was always a possibility. In a world without written contracts, without courts of law that could enforce commercial agreements, without any of the institutional scaffolding that modern people take for granted when they do business. Everything depended on the ability to read people, to understand who was trustworthy and who was not, to build relationships strong enough to hold when they were tested. And in the life of a long-distance trader, they were always tested eventually. These traders carried more than goods. They carried knowledge. Every time they arrived in a new community, they brought with them something priceless that no amount of copper or ivory or dried fish could replicate. They brought news of the wider world. They could tell you what was happening 300 miles away, what goods had become scarce at the Atlantic coast, what new demands the Portuguese merchants at Luanda were making, what political upheaval was occurring in the kingdom of Kazembe to the east, what new opportunity had opened up in the lands between the Luba kingdom and the Lunda heartland. This knowledge was currency, sometimes the most valuable currency in any transaction. And in exchange for this knowledge, the communities they visited gave them something equally irreplaceable. They gave them hospitality. They gave them rest. They gave them local knowledge about what lay ahead on the route, about which river was running high from recent rains, about which local chief was in a cooperative mood, and which one was currently suspicious of strangers, about where the best water could be found in the next 3 days of travel. This exchange of information for information, layered under and around and through the exchange of physical goods, was the true circulatory system of the Lunda trade network. The goods were the visible blood, but the information was the oxygen dissolved within it, invisible but essential, present in every transaction, even when it was never directly named. You have had relationships like this in your own life. Relationships where the surface exchange, the words spoken, the favors done, the visible back and forth, was not really the point. Where the true exchange was happening at a deeper level, where what was really being traded was trust, safety, the ongoing reassurance that someone had your back, that you were known and valued and could count on something reliable in a world that offered no guarantees. These relationships were the most important ones, the ones you return to in memory, the ones that shaped you more profoundly than any single dramatic event ever could. The long-distance traders of the Lunda Empire were the keepers of these relationships at a continental scale. They were not just moving goods from one place to another. They were renewing, with every journey, the living web of relationships that made the Lunda Empire what it was. Every time a trader arrived in a distant community and was welcomed by a chief who remembered him from previous visits, that welcome was a renewal, a reaffirmation, a confirmation that the network was real and continuous and mutually committed. Now let us talk about the women of this network. Because the history you were taught, if you were taught any of this at all, tended to center the men, the kings, the warriors, the named explorers, and the titled merchants. But in the Lunda Empire, as in any civilization that has survived long enough to be worth studying, women were not peripheral. They were structural. They were load-bearing in ways that the visible architecture of power often concealed, but never eliminated. At the highest level of the Lunda state, women of the royal lineage held titles and authorities that existed parallel to those of male rulers rather than subordinate to them. The Ruage title, named after the founding queen who married Chibinda Ilunga, was not merely ceremonial. It carried genuine political authority over specific domains of Lunda governance and ritual life. The woman who held this title at any given point in the empire's history was not a decoration on the institution of kingship. She was a pillar of it. Without her presence and her participation, the institution was structurally incomplete. But royal women were only the most visible part of a much broader story. Throughout the Lunda trade network, at every level, women were active participants in economic life. Women controlled local markets. Women processed and preserved the goods that entered long-distance trade. The dried fish that moved through the network did not dry itself. The agricultural surplus that sustained traders on long journeys through sparsely populated interior territories did not grow or harvest or store itself. Women's labor, women's knowledge, women's organizational capacity, these were the invisible foundation beneath every visible commercial transaction. Women also managed the guest relationships that made long-distance trade possible. When a trader arrived in a community and was taken in by a local household, that household's ability to offer genuine hospitality, food prepared with skill and care, comfortable shelter, the social warmth that allowed a traveler to rest completely rather than simply to stop, was almost always in the hands of women. The trader's ability to do his work, to negotiate well, to present himself as trustworthy and worth doing business with, depended in no small part on how well he had been allowed to rest. And his rest depended on women's labor and women's judgment and women's quiet mastery of the domestic arts of a world that did not separate the domestic from the commercial as sharply as later periods would. You know something about this invisible labor. You've watched it in your own life. You've seen the ways that the most essential work is often the work that receives the least acknowledgement. The organizing, the sustaining, the continuous attention to the details that make everything else possible. The work that holds the structure together from the inside, never quite visible enough to be easily named, but immediately obvious in its absence when it stops. The Lunda Empire was held together, in significant part, by this kind of work, by women who knew the roots, who remembered the names, who maintained the relationships, who processed the goods, who fed the travelers, who taught the children what the network was and how it functioned and why it mattered. And by doing these things with sustained dedication across generations, they gave the empire something no army could provide. They gave it memory. They gave it continuity. They gave it the ability to be not just a structure but a culture, a way of being in the world that was carried in bodies and households and daily practices long after any formal political institution might have weakened or changed. Now, there is something else about the Lunda trade network that you need to understand tonight. Something that distinguishes it from the simple picture of goods moving along paths that a basic history lesson might paint. The Lunda network was connected to the entire world, not metaphorically, not aspirationally, actually, in real and documentable and historically verifiable ways. By the 18th century, the Lunda trade network formed a critical bridge in what historians now recognize as a true continental trade system linking the Atlantic coast of Africa to its Indian Ocean coast. Consider what this means for a moment. The Atlantic Ocean lies on the western edge of the African continent. The Indian Ocean lies on the eastern edge. Between them, stretching for thousands of miles across some of the most challenging terrain on the planet, Central Africa lay for centuries as what European observers called the unknown interior, unmapped, unexplored, mysterious. But it was not unknown to the people who lived in it. It was not unmapped by the minds and memories of the traders who crossed it regularly. It was not unexplored by the Lunda merchants and their counterparts in the Ovimbundu trading states to the west and the Swahili trading cities to the east. These people had been crossing this supposed mystery for generations. They had built roads through it. They had established rest stations along it. They had created communities of trust and exchange that made its crossing not an adventure, but a routine. The goods that moved along this continental bridge tell the story most clearly. Portuguese cloth arrived at Luanda on the Angolan coast aboard ships from Lisbon. That cloth was then traded inland, passing through Ovimbundu merchant hands and eventually entering the Lunda network, moving eastward across the continent. At the same time, glass beads from India arrived at the Swahili port of Kilwa or Mozambique on the Indian Ocean coast, carried there by Arab and Indian merchants as part of a trade that had been ongoing for centuries. Those beads then moved inland through the networks connecting the coast to the kingdom of Kazembe, and from there deeper into the Lunda interior. This means that a Lunda chief in the heartland of Central Africa might wear Portuguese cloth on one shoulder and Indian glass beads around their neck simultaneously, might sit in judgment of a trade dispute while holding a copper ingot in one hand and a piece of locally carved ivory in the other, might eat food preserved with salt from a Lunda-controlled salt source while drinking from a vessel that had been traded through a network originating on the Indian Ocean coast. This is not the picture of an isolated interior civilization waiting to be discovered by the outside world. This is a civilization fully embedded in global commerce, fully aware of distant markets, fully engaged with the wider world's desires and the wider world's products, fully and deliberately positioned at the center of something vast. Let your mind rest with that image for a moment. A Lunda chief at the center of the world, not at the margins of it, not at the edge of some European imagined hierarchy of civilization, but at the center of a real, functional, continent-spanning commercial world that connected 2 oceans and dozens of cultures and hundreds of communities across thousands of miles. At the center of something that required intelligence and organization and sustained diplomatic effort and the patient building of trust across generations. Your breathing is slower now. Good. Let it slow further still. Let each breath arrive without effort. Let each exhale carry away whatever remains of the day's tension. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Nothing that requires your vigilance. You are safe. The night is holding you. The story is holding you. And you are exactly where you need to be. The Portuguese called the Lunda lands the interior of Angola. The British called the same region the interior of Rhodesia or Nyasaland, depending on which direction they were approaching from. The Europeans, who eventually mapped these territories, believed, with the particular confidence of people who have never been taught to doubt themselves, that they were discovering something that had not existed before their arrival, that their maps were creating reality rather than recording it, that the act of writing a European name on a place was somehow the moment that place became real. But the places were already real. The roots were already established. The relationships were already old. The commerce was already sophisticated. The civilization was already complex. The traders who moved through the Lunda network had been moving through it since before anyone now living was born, before the grandparents of anyone now living were born, before the great-grandparents of anyone living drew their first breath. The arrival of European names and European maps changed nothing about the underlying reality. It only obscured it, temporarily. You understand this obscuring. You've seen it happen in your own lifetime. The way a dominant narrative can make invisible things that are real and present and important. The way a story told loudly enough and confidently enough can crowd out a truer story that has always been there, waiting patiently for the noise to subside. You've watched revisionary history slowly recover truths that were always true, even when they were buried. You've watched understanding expand in your own lifetime to include people and places and civilizations that earlier versions of the story left out. This is one of those truths. The Lunda Empire's trade network was real. It was vast. It was sophisticated. It was built by intelligent, creative, hard-working human beings who understood their world and their place within it with extraordinary clarity. And it deserves to be known. It deserves to be held in memory with the same care and respect that any great human achievement deserves, not as an exotic footnote to a more important story, as the story itself. In the 19th century, the world that had sustained the Lunda Empire for nearly 3 centuries began to change in ways that were difficult to resist and impossible to fully absorb. The slave trade, which had touched the edges of the Lunda network in complicated and damaging ways for generations, was formally abolished by European powers. But its abolition came attached to a new and equally violent project: the colonization of Africa, the systematic partition and occupation of the continent by European powers, who drew lines on maps in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 with no reference whatsoever to the people who already lived within those lines, who already had their own political systems, their own commercial networks, their own ways of organizing life and authority and exchange. The Berlin Conference, as it is known in history, carved Africa into European possessions with the efficiency and indifference of people dividing an inheritance they believe they have already rightfully received. The lands of the Lunda Empire were split between 3 colonial powers: The Belgian Congo claimed the Lunda heartland. The British Northern Rhodesia claimed much of what had been the kingdom of Kazemba's territory. Portuguese Angola claimed the western lands where Lunda influence had extended along the trade routes toward the Atlantic coast. These new lines cut across the trade routes like blades through thread, a network that had been built over generations through sustained effort and patient relationship building and the slow accumulation of trust, was suddenly illegal to traverse in the ways it had always been traversed. Traders who had moved freely across a vast territory were now required to have papers, to cross official borders, to interact with colonial administrators who had no understanding of and no interest in the commercial and cultural systems they were disrupting. But here is something you know about human systems that are built on genuine relationships rather than imposed structures. They are more durable than the forces that try to suppress them. They go underground. They adapt. They continue in modified forms. They survive in memory even when they cannot survive in practice. And they wait. The Lunda people did not disappear. Their identity did not dissolve. Their memory of who they were and what they had built did not evaporate under the pressure of colonial naming and colonial boundary drawing and colonial administration. The Muant Yav, the ruler of the Lunda, continued to be recognized by Lunda people across the colonial divisions, not as a political sovereign recognized by Belgian or British or Portuguese colonial law, but as something that colonial law could not reach, as a cultural and spiritual authority rooted in a history and identity that went deeper than any European map could go. This is not a small thing. This is, in fact, one of the most important things you can understand about the history of the Lunda Empire and what it left behind. Colonialism changed what was possible on the surface of life. It changed borders and commerce and formal political institutions. But it could not reach the places where a people's identity truly lives. In memory, in language, in the stories told at night, when the day's required performances are done and people speak in their own voices about who they really are. The Lunda are still there today. The Muant Yav institution still exists in the Democratic Republic of Congo. People in the region still identify as Lunda, still carry in their bodies and their language and their social practices the imprint of an empire that built something extraordinary across the Central African interior for nearly 3 centuries. Still remember, in ways both conscious and below consciousness, what it meant to be part of something vast and connected and proud. This is the most human thing of all, the survival of identity through systems designed to erase it, the persistence of belonging through borders designed to divide it, the continuation of memory through histories designed to replace it. You know this persistence. You've seen it in your own lifetime and in the lives of people you've loved. The way something essential about a person survives everything that tries to diminish or redirect or deny it. The way the core of a thing holds even when everything around it has been forced to change. It is very late now. The night has reached its deepest point, the hour when the world is most still. when even the sounds that accompany darkness, the distant traffic, the occasional voice, the creak of the house settling into itself, have grown silent or so familiar that they are no longer heard as sounds, but simply as part of the texture of the night. You are part of this stillness now. Your body is part of it. Your breathing is part of it. The story you've been carrying through this hour is part of it. Let the Lunda Empire rest now in you, the way all true and important things eventually rest. Not at the surface where you have to actively hold them, but deeper, in that part of you that retains what matters without effort or intention. The part of you that will remember tomorrow when you wake that something shifted tonight, that some understanding arrived that wasn't present before, that the world, the real world, the full and complex and extraordinary world of human civilization is larger and richer and more intricate than you were ever taught to imagine. You've traveled tonight across the red earth paths of Central Africa. You've stood at the Musumba and felt the living pulse of a civilization built on connection. You followed the copper and the salt and the ivory and the beeswax along routes worn smooth by the footsteps of generations. You've met the long-distance traders who carried the network in their bodies. You've understood the women who held it in their hands. You've seen the connections that reached from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. You've witnessed the resilience of a people whose identity survived everything that tried to erase it. None of this required you to travel. None of it required anything from you beyond the willingness to be still, to listen, to allow something true to arrive in the space that stillness creates. This is one of the most profound gifts that age brings, if you let it. The gift of stillness. The gift of knowing that you don't have to go anywhere to understand something important. That truth comes to those who have learned to stop chasing it. The Lunda traders who moved through the Central African interior were not searching for something unknown. They were renewing something already established, retracing paths already worn, strengthening relationships already built. There is a profound dignity in this, in the renewal rather than the invention, in the maintenance rather than the discovery, in the humble, continuous, patient work of keeping alive what has been built. You have done this kind of work in your own life. You have maintained relationships over years and decades when it would have been easier to let them go. You have returned to people and places and commitments, not because they were new or exciting, but because they were yours, because the web of connection in your own life has been something worth protecting, worth renewing, worth showing up for again and again, in all weather, in all seasons, when the energy was there and when it wasn't. This is what the Lunda understood at a civilizational scale, and it is what you have understood in your own quiet, persistent, deeply human way. The network holds because someone keeps holding it. The connections endure because someone keeps returning to them. The empire lasts because the people within it choose, day after day, generation after generation, to act as if it matters, to treat the web of relationship as something worth protecting, to show up. And now it is time to rest. Now it is time to let the empire recede back into the centuries where it lives, to let the traders fold their journeys into sleep, to let the rivers flow in darkness without witness, to let the Musumba grow quiet in the deep Central African night, the fires banked, the trading done for today, the stories told, the connections renewed, the great web of the Lunda world settling into its own rest until morning calls it back to life. You have received something real tonight, something that was always true and is now yours in a new way. Carry it gently. Let it deepen in you the way all good things deepen when they are given space and time and the unhurried attention of a quiet, restful mind. The covers are warm around you. Your body is heavy with the good weight of rest that is finally, completely arriving. Your eyes are soft behind their closed lids. Your breath has found its own slow, natural rhythm, the rhythm your body has always known that it returns to when you stop asking it to be anywhere other than here. You are here. The night is here. The story has found its ending. And you, beneath these covers, in this room, in this quiet hour that belongs entirely to you, are exactly enough, exactly whole, exactly where every path you have ever walked has been carrying you toward this moment, toward this rest, toward the simple and extraordinary grace of being alive and still and at peace in the darkness. The red earth, paths of the Lunda heartland are growing still now. The traders have returned to their fires. The rivers are moving in darkness without sound. The great web of connection that stretched across a continent is resting, as all living things must rest, gathering itself for another day, another season, another generation of renewal and continuation, and the quiet, persistent work of keeping the world connected. And you are resting with it, part of the same ancient pattern, part of the same endless human story of connection and belonging, and the stubborn, beautiful persistence of things that matter. Sleep now. Let the empire dream. Let the rivers carry you. Let the darkness hold you the way the Lunda heartland held its people. Completely, without condition, without asking you to be anything other than what you already are. The fires die down, the stories settle, and the world grows still. Let your thoughts drift away like embers on the wind. Good night. You've journeyed far through time tonight. Now it's time to journey into dreams. Close your eyes, breathe, and let sleep find you.